So, John, we're going to talk a little bit about engineering today, which is not my area of expertise, but something I'm always been fascinated in. I'm kind of curious, what is engineering in the context of you and what you do? Because there's like mechanical engineering, there's, coders, product engineers. So what is it you focus on?
The really funny thing is that in Canada, you can't actually call the average person an engineer that is an engineer in the States because there's a professional society of engineers for which you have to have a membership to call yourself an engineer, kind of like a doctor. But today we're going to talk largely about software development and software engineering. When somebody's got to sit down and write some code and build products and put stuff together, whether it's on the internet or on your phone or just an application or, just something that's like running inside of a bank teller.
I imagine, especially the coding part, not to say I'm a coder, but I've even vibe coded a few things now with AI. And so I imagine engineering has been quite significantly disrupted by AI tools. Can you tell me a bit about like kind of how engineering has been impacted by that?
Absolutely. So what we've seen is this weird sort of shift towards people having an instant fear response as a business. And they're sitting down and saying, okay, I've been told that there's all these great tools and I can quadruple productivity or 10x productivity, which means I need fewer people, as opposed to we can make more money with the team that we have. So there's an immediate bean counter reaction that says, hey, we should figure out how to do more with less. And that it's deeply true. I stood up a website called routinemath.com where the entire front end was vibe coded in about 10 hours. And there's an interesting point that I want to make about that is I was able to do that very quickly and it's very solid, but I also know where the skeletons are buried, right? It's a great idea for anyone to sit down and pick up these tools and vibe code something, put together a prototype and get it to the point that it's working. But on the other side of that, there's a challenge that it's not necessarily solid. It's not a good foundation. It's like trying to build a skyscraper out of drywall, right? And so what we're seeing now is there's a big trend towards hiring people who are AI native programmers who understand the business and understand all the pieces that they need to do to make it successful technologically. And there's like this weird gap being created for very junior engineers who don't have the experience necessary in order to successfully figure out when they have to stop a prompt or redo it or whether the output is bad, right? I gave a live vibe coding demonstration to an entire company one time where I built a product right in front of them in 20 minutes. And the feedback that I got from everybody is like, I would be afraid to stop it in the middle of what it's doing the way that you did because I don't know what's happening there when I saw it was going off the rails. And it really does. And that's kind of the differentiator, which is why it's, so difficult to build very good engineering teams these days.
How traditionally, I guess, have you built an engineering team and how has AI changed that process and what does the modern engineering team look like?
I'm now celebrating 30 years as a software professional. And throughout the course of that, I've always been involved in the hiring process. I've always really liked that. I've helped create test questions. I've helped conduct interview. I've helped do culture match. Team building in 2026 is very different than it used to be. It used to be you'd sit down, you'd figure out what you need to do to have what roles you need to hire for. You'd write a job description, you'd put it out some places, you'd maybe spend some money on different platforms, and then you would measure the volume of resumes that you have come in and try to figure out how to make that number bigger and better. How do I get 100 resumes? How do I make sure that 50 of them are good? And I've been helping multiple companies hire in the past year. And the problem is now the opposite. You get 5,000 resumes. And most of them you don't want to spend any time looking at. So you've kind of flipped the script a little bit. And I had had to sit down and re-examine all the things I looked for in building a structured hiring process and say, okay, what's different now? And how do I solve the problem of this gigantic glut of resumes that is coming in order to find the one candidate that we want to fill the role?
You had some sort of like problem solving like task that you at least used to give. Can you refresh my memory on what that was and if you're still using it and why or why not?
I asked people to make me a tic-tac-toe game. And it's simple enough for somebody to do that they shouldn't need to resort to AI tools, but I could spot an AI implementation of tic-tac-toe in about 30 seconds at this point. And yes, I've timed it. A lot of people want to give you a real-time coding project, while you're on the camera, but the problem there is you'll get a false negative. And by a false negative, what I mean is that you're going to get rid of that candidate because they're going to choke on the spot and you're going to lose an opportunity at a very good programmer because most people can't do that. Lots of software developers are introverted, but the pressure of trying to solve a problem while somebody's staring at you, that's very hard. Not very many people do that. There are some companies that specifically want those high pressure programmers, and they're okay with discarding somewhere north of 60% of their candidates to find that special programmer who's got those chops. But that's not everybody. And the challenge these days is like, in order to find that person, you want to sit down and say, okay, I'm going to go through this process. I need to get these resumes in. I need to look at them. I need to pick a subset of these somehow out of 5,000 instead of, 100 to 500 to figure out enough people that you can have a conversation with and give them a code screen. I used to have my code screen set up on the other side of an in-person or a video interview for 30 minutes to assess culture fit and whether or not they'd be a good fit for this role. A lot of times, 30-minute conversation I have, there's a percent chance on the other side of that I will tell them, it's like, I don't think you're a good fit for this role because I don't know why you want this job. You want to get out of your current job. You're not interested in this job. You're interested in not that job. And that's a very different thing. And making sure that people are aligned and interested in the role is really important. Hey, I just need a job is not necessarily a gigantic recipe for success for a lot of people.
That's fair. I also just want to call out the fact that you kind of take introverts into account in your hiring. I'm an ambivert that kind of leans introvert. I read this book, The Power of Quiet, and lots of information on how we're basically optimizing for extroversion. So I really appreciate that you do that.
Yeah, I call that out in a lot of people's hiring processes. The vast majority of engineers are deeply introverted, just as a heads up, right? So if you're basically trying to optimize your process for non-introverted software developers, you're basically saying, I don't want 60 to 70% of the talent pool interested in coming to work with me.
I hope that other people pick up on that, because I do feel like introverts have a lot of really valuable assets that they bring to the table that just you don't get in other places. So I did want to ask though, because we're talking about the hiring process. You mentioned like video calls. I have heard that there is a problem with people just straight up having someone else do the video call for them when they're applying. And I'm kind of curious how real that is, if you've seen that happen, and kind of how you combat it, if you can.
It's really wild because I started hearing about this earlier in the year also. For context, around June of last year, I had spent some time starting to help a few companies hire. And I didn't run into this. And I kept hearing all these horror stories about interviewing. And the reason was I was interviewing people for hybrid roles, which means that some of it is in the office and some of it is at home. So you had to be at least in the same city and you had to have an in-person meeting. The instant I went to start helping a couple companies that are fully remote, the gloves came off. It's like those old classic 1400s maps was like, here be monsters. That's what the world of hiring looks like today. The company I was at, there was this big kerfuffle because the person who interviewed was not the same person who showed up to work. And we made a decision at that point at every step of the interview. And, this is a free tip for anybody who's doing remote hiring. The instant you enter the interview, take a screenshot of the candidate and post it. We have a Slack channel for each candidate. That's how we organize our process. Everyone needs to put a screenshot of the candidate in there to make sure that they match up. And then when the person shows up to work, you take a picture of it as well. And, as a secondary point of that, there was an interesting survey put up by one of the folks on LinkedIn who's like a recruiting influencer. It's like, let me read this to you and I'll call out the results because the poll just closed and it's very timely. If you show up for a video interview with the camera off, is that okay? And what should you do? 66% of the people said that they would continue the call and they would just mention that the camera is supposed to be on. For me, that's a hard no. I'm in the 28% of the people who would politely end the call. It's like, listen, I need to see you and I need to look at you while I'm talking to you in this interview, because there are real-time AI cheating tools out there, and also making sure that somebody's not, looking around and doing something on a different screen and looking for hints or tips or something like that to be successful. There's a certain amount of engagement that you need to get from looking at a person. I don't care about the background, right? Put up a virtual background. That's great. Whatever. You have a messy room. I don't care, but I need to see you when I'm interviewing you. And it's a hard no that if somebody's going to, not have a camera available, it's like, okay, you can reschedule the interview to when you have one available so that we could do the interview. But without that, you are just inviting trouble and bad actors.
I'm honestly surprised to hear that 66%. Like, that seems very high, because I'm kind of in the same boat as you. Like, if the camera's not working, there's a lot that could cause problems down the road. I wanted to backtrack for a minute regarding like vibe coding. One of the things that I've found the hardest with AI is standardization. Every single time the output's always a little different. Even when you give it a really good prompt, it's getting better, but I still notice lapses. I'm kind of curious what role vibe coding does play in a modern engineering team.
Plenty, because the velocity acceleration you get is incredible. There are places where I don't like using it, and there are places where it makes tremendous sense. And it's like anything else, it's the right tool. You don't use a screwdriver to hit a nail in, you use a hammer for it. I think that you can use it for some amount of back-end software development, but in a very constrained case. If you're having the whole back-end built for you and your AI, per your point, you're going to have a whole world of hurt because it's going to change stuff that it's not supposed to. If you're doing precision strikes on particular methods on the server, great. But the vast majority of client code, it's inexpensive, it's Swiss cheese, it's okay if it's a little wonky because it's just running in a browser or it's a simple mobile application. You don't necessarily need the rigor. If you're doing ISO 9001 certified processes for medical equipment, you absolutely should not be using AI in your tools this year. There will come a time when that will make sense and that there will be safeguards and systems in place to make it good. But, we're on year 2, year 3 of the tools being available, and the tremendous value you can get out of building a prototype is just surreal. So for me, it's important to have those skills and be able to use them. But when I'm interviewing, I also want to make sure that you at least have some sort of engineering training. I saw a horrific memo from an investor to a startup founder fairly recently that says, don't hire anybody who has graduated after 2024, because if you work backwards to when they started school, they've never known a world without AI supplemented education. And that the assumption is that everybody is cheating to get through college, and they're not building the foundation and those building blocks anymore. Is it true? Hard to say yes or no, but absolutely it's a thing that people have to contemplate. Do these people really have the skills to do the job? And how do you detect that in an interview? Having a webinar on the 30th, I've uncovered some pretty good tactics to help engineering leaders work their way through how to solve these problems and how to identify somebody who's using tools that are cheating and preventing them from giving you a clean interview, as well as some of the other things that I do for the offline portions that I look for as well that are very clear tells. And, some of this has been solved by people who've made it through the process. Then I look back and say, how did this happen? And setting up those safeguards and those steps in your process to make sure that the person that you're hiring is the person that you want. They live in the country they say they live in, which, believe it or not, is a thing, and that they actually have the skills to do the job. And once you've nailed those 3 things, then you're in pretty good shape. But you'd be surprised how easy it is to tear through those barriers by bad actors and people who just, they're looking to make a quick buck, or they don't care if they get fired, or I don't even know the mindset honestly, in all cases.
It's very interesting where we are now with AI, because there are, I think, very serious concerns about the knowledge transfer from the older generation to the younger generation. AI is just taking entry-level jobs. So when senior and junior people move up or retire, there's just nothing to replace them. And I don't know if AI will eventually just take that. But then what happens when the senior and junior people just are completely out of the picture? Is AI just everywhere? That's more of just a rhetorical question. I don't expect you to have an answer to that. But I also just wanted to mention, you do? Yeah, please go ahead then.
So if you go to Routine Math, the website that I built, I spent some time in Southern California working with a local boot camp. It's called Learning Fuse. They're currently on hiatus because they're struggling with some of these very same issues. But there's two junior engineers linked to the project that you can go and look at their LinkedIn profiles. I had them each build a small piece of the software package because, make a dumb Darth Vader joke here, but it's I call it, you have to be sort of like Sith-like in a sense. Always 2 there are is what Yoda said about it. I think that if you're a senior engineer, you should have a sort of like a noblesse oblige to your profession to find somebody to start imparting parts of your craft to. And they drift in and out, right? I don't have somebody that's my very clear, number 2 ongoing protege. My oldest son has his own startup and he's done most of the building there. That's a given. But I do want to make sure that I'm at least taking one person under my wing. And if every senior software engineer committed the same effort to do that for 10 to 20 hours a year, I think everybody would not have a worry about it. What's going to be interesting is that the need for that profession is not going to be gone. The problem is how do you make a master craftsman? How do you get that Malcolm Gladwell 10,000 blink hours if all you're doing is vibe coding all day long? And the answer is you can't, right? And so there's going to be people are going to revisit this. There's going to be a 5-year gap where it's going to be very hard to hire that mid to senior tier engineer to join your organization who's on their way to to architect, while the people who are currently at architects and CTO levels are aging out of the workforce, right? A term for this type of job displacement that's coming around that I've heard recently by somebody I'm working with on their startup and helping them. They call it the silver tsunami, right? It's like this wave of gray-haired people that are just on their way out of the workforce and they're not coming back. And what do you replace them with? And for the beautiful part about it is that there are a lot of jobs that people don't want that this is going to be great for, but for the professions where that kind of skill development is necessary, people are going to need to figure out a way to put in the work to become successful there. I'm doing my part. After the webinar that I've set up to talk to hiring managers, I'm going to put a few things up there for free to talk to younger engineers. Things like, what should you have in your resume to get noticed by a hiring manager? Or what do I look at that I'll take a resume and I'll spend 10 seconds on it. And what does that 10-second smoke test look like? And what am I looking for to move it forward? What am I looking for to put it into the discard pile, right? Because I've got a very quick filter and I've got it down pretty quick at this point. And I just want to give that away to everybody so they can at least think about it through the lens of what their resume looks like. And through a handful of conversations with people who are junior to some discussions about internships with others, paid and unpaid, some of the stuff you can't, there's no revenue in this. We're all taking a risk on a project together. I think that those things will self-select over a 5-year window, and you're going to see senior engineers gravitate towards companies where they have a budget for junior engineers because they're saying, hey, we recognize the importance of continuity for ourselves and for our business, that we're willing to invest in junior people as a virtue signaling attempt to recruit better engineers. So that's the really wordy answer to your rhetorical question.
I love that. You mentioned velocity in coding, and I'm kind of curious what you've seen on that front. I was talking with John Szeder. He's a Forbes analyst. He has a podcast all about AI and tech. Great person. We were talking like right as ChatGPT 5 was coming out, and he was like, this is a game changer for coding. He was predicting like 500x output increase. I'm kind of curious if you've seen like a velocity increase since AI has hit.
Well, I'll give you my one data point of what was impressive in the middle of last year is that, I took a project that would normally take me 3 months at, $5,000 a month for an engineer to build out all the stuff. And I did it with 10 hours of vibe coding. We are going to see substantive transformational changes. We're at the point now where everything that we see after the gains that we have are going to be incremental. I don't think that we're going to see significant, massive shifts in software development. I do think that we will see significant multi-order of magnitude shifts in media asset creation in movies and games, but that's like a 6-hour conversation at a minimum for all the things that are going to happen in that space and what that looks like in 2028 and 2029. But for pure software development, it is easy to go 5 times faster than you used to if you're doing it right. And going 10 times faster is a little harder right now, but it also depends on what specifically you're doing, right? If all I'm doing is building web tools, front-end applications, I'm going a lot faster than if I was doing it by hand. On the server, as your system gets complicated and you start adding features, those start to slow down, and you do have that odd moment where I probably should have done this by hand because the amount of time it's taking to rework this to get it to a good place, we're not getting the same level of gains. It's like this is 1.3 times faster as opposed to 5 times faster once you're doing that.
You mentioned that you can now tell when AI has been used within 30 seconds with your Tic-Tac-Toe task. I'm curious how you can tell that in 30 seconds.
So the easiest way to detect whether you have something that was output by AI is to try and do it with AI yourself. If somebody tries to one-shot a Tic-Tac-Toe game and send it to me, I know exactly what that looks like because I one-shot a Tic-Tac-Toe game with an AI tool because it takes you 5 seconds and it's awful quality. If that's what somebody's trying to do, and I will say that in the interview, I want you to show me your software engineering skills. You're going to fail a senior software engineer interview if you try to one-shot this. And then when they send it to me, I'm like, look, this is the exact same as the thing that I built in 5 seconds. And I told you not to do that. And it's glaringly obvious. The whole point of Tic-Tac-Toe is it's a simple program. I want to see your best work. The bar is here. I want you to jump over the bar and go here. There's a lot of people that I've had online debates with about this who say it's like, well, there's no rubric for what makes a good tic-tac-toe game. And I'm like, well, yes, there is. And there's a rubric for what makes it a good implementation. I have 10 things that I look for and I give a score from 1 to 10. I mostly give out 4 out of 10s compared to anything, but I'm not going to tell you what the rubric is because if I tell you what the rubric is, you're just going to do exactly what I tell you and get a 10 out of 10, right? But there are very specific things that I look for that tell me that this is an original implementation or it's a good implementation or you understood the problem that I'm solving for. And I've given 1 or 2 10 out of 10s in the past decade. right? It's not
Wow.
that common, and you have to understand what you're looking for, and you have to figure it out. And everyone says, well, I don't think that's a fair examination. And I'm like, well, then take the test and send me your implementation and I'll tell you what I think, right? Everyone who I've given that response to for, here's what your tic-tac-toe implementation looks like to me, and here's the score. I think probably less than 10 times ever I've had any objection to it. The vast majority of people are like, your feedback is fair. I agree with everything you've said. This is something that I could have done differently, and I appreciate it. And the good news is, if somebody is earnest and they give me a tic-tac-toe implementation and they miss, I will tell them, reach out to me in 6 months' time and let's revisit this, because I have a follow-up question that tells me if they learned anything from what they did in the first one. And what's really sad is more than 50% of the people that I give the follow-up question to will make the same mistakes that they did in the first one. And I can even go back to the original email, pull them out and say, you did the same thing all over again. Clearly you didn't learn anything.
Stern but forgiving. Anytime you can give people the opportunity to learn, I think is a good thing. I wanted to just hone in on the webinar, give us some details on that. Who would benefit most from it and why?
Yeah, absolutely. So if you have to hire in 2026 and you're discovering that you're being inundated with, all kinds of noise, and you don't know whether the candidates are real, you don't know how to test if somebody really knows what they real, or maybe you had to let somebody go that was a recent hire who couldn't do the job successfully, then that's who I'm speaking to. I just finished putting everything together the other day. I've had my first couple of signups. I'm excited about that. I want to kind of talk through traditionally how people have done hiring and what's different in 2026, why the signals have changed. What's the difference between a remote candidate and a hybrid candidate, because it's incredibly different. And then how do we evaluate whether you have an authentically good engineer versus somebody who's just either doing something in real time to deceive you or is using these tools to try and get the job without actually putting in any of the work. And, whether or not you want to use AI tools on the other side of it, if you are definitely looking to hire a classical engineer and you want to go through all the different things that I've identified as failure points and failure modes in that process, I've got a pretty good list of things for you to look at and some pretty clear examples of things that you can do that you can put out there in order to find a genuine engineer who would be great for your business.
I love that. Anything in closing you wanted to specifically highlight or mention?
Appreciate the opportunity to talk about some of the big challenges that we're facing, and future conversations of AI, or if people who are interested in that, and how it's affecting the workforce and what they could do to be better prepared for that future. I'm always happy to have that conversation with people and kind of help people get to the next level. I tell anybody, you have a specific problem. If there's something I could do to help you, I'll take a half hour of my day to speak to you. I've got a half hour for anybody.
I appreciate that. And I've personally benefited from that. So doubly appreciate that. Easiest way for people to contact you, what is it?
JohnSzeder@gmail.com, or find me on LinkedIn.
Excellent. Thank you so much, John. I really appreciate the time. Everyone else, please go check out John and maybe consider signing up for his webinar.